All right, now with us is Tom Mulcair, CTV News political commentator and former NDP leader, to give us the year in review and discuss 2023's top political stories as 2023 winds to a close. Tom, thanks for joining us today.
Good to be with you, Renee.
All right, let's start with the Chinese government and allegations of election interference. Where are we now on these allegations?
Now, that dominated the news for several months at the beginning of 2023. We'll recall that Mr. Trudeau did his best to try to keep shoveling it forward. He didn't want to have an open, full inquiry. He named David Johnston, who we later found out had, a great deal of proximity both to the Trudeau family and to the Trudeau Foundation, as his special interlocutor on these issues. And everybody was saying, okay, this is impossible. You're not going to get to the bottom of it. He issued his own report, his first report, and no one was satisfied with it. So all of a sudden, this person, David Johnston, who had had a sterling public service career, he was an incredibly respected governor general. All of a sudden, he was forced to resign from this position. So this special rapporteur didn't get anywhere. So now Mr. Trudeau has named a respected judge. Her name is Madame Justice Hogue. She's going to be carrying out an inquiry now. But already there's some controversy because she singled out the Conservatives and said, if you turn this into a gong show, then we might not even let you sit in and observe. And they don't have any role except for Michael Chong personally as the party. And that's a very surprising turn of events, because one of the issues here is whether or not the Canadian government knew that there had been interference in the election. We do seem to have enough indication that it particularly targeted Conservative candidates, and one would have thought that the Conservatives would have had a greater role in this. We'll see. As I say, Madam Justice Hogue is highly respected, and I think she's going to be up to the task. But this is just one of the two big issues we had on the international front. We also had the allegation right at the beginning of the fall session by Mr. Trudeau in Parliament that the Indian government was involved in the assassination of a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil. Now, there was a lack of evidence for that, and a lot of people were pushing back and saying that Trudeau might have overstepped. But it turns out from information that became public in the United States in a prosecution and in a court case there, that there is evidence of that. So it's a shocking turn of events. Of course, the Indian government denied it completely, but there is more than enough information, Renee, to show that that was the case. So these are the two largest countries in the world in terms of population. India is now the largest, and China's the second largest. They're important trading partners. Canada has an Indo-Pacific, whole strategy that we're trying to develop, but without India, that doesn't mean anything. So we're going to have to start repairing some of those relationships, because the fact that they had done something wrong is something that we have to deal with. But at the same time, how we deal with it, has to be done in such a way that it doesn't just exacerbate the problem. So that's where I think on the international front, that was one of the weakest parts of the year 2023.
Let's talk about the Israel-Hamas war now. Since October 7th, the messaging has changed, which has caused division in the Liberal Party. Can you tell us more about where we are on this now?
That division in and of itself is news, because Mr. Trudeau has always had ascendancy over his caucus. He's always had a great deal of respect and deference, and people just didn't push back. And if they did, it was in the caucus room behind closed doors. This stuff never became public. And at the beginning of this war, where Israel vowed after those horrific terrorist attacks on October 7th that you just referenced, said that they were going to get rid of Hamas. Well, it turned into such a horror story in and of itself, so many civilians dying, that there were people in caucus, about 24 of them, in fact, who signed a request that Canada should take an official position in favor of a ceasefire. Now, Mr. Trudeau held back on that, as did Melanie Joly, saying, well, after what happened, Israel is going to have to be able to defend itself. And that was the clear message they wanted to send. But as that head of steam continued to grow, and the horrors that were on people's TV screens night after night were pushing the government in a direction that was completely different. So we announced with a couple of our Five Eyes partners, in particular New Zealand and Australia, that we were signing on to 3 preconditions, in which case we would ask for a ceasefire. Those preconditions were Hamas was to lay down its arms, was to stop using people as human shields, and that they were to release all the hostages. Of course, none of those things happened, and yet Mr. Trudeau had Canada vote in favor of the UN resolution for a ceasefire, pure and simple. So that did seem to a lot of people to be a bit of a contradiction, saying that there were conditions precedent, these preconditions. All of a sudden, when those hadn't been met, we were still in favor of a complete ceasefire. This is a horrible war. It's one of 2 horrible wars going on in the world right now. The other one has been going for so long, we pay maybe less attention than we should. But Russia's illegal war against Ukraine is also extremely dangerous for the planet. The same way there are issues on the northern border of Israel that could easily get out of hand very rapidly, so too between Russia and Ukraine. And the President of the United States, Biden, has had so much difficulty even being able to continue to supply arms so that Ukraine can defend itself against this illegal invasion by Russia.
Yes.
Now, while we're on that topic, we can make the link to the political year that we were just talking about and say this, that one of the big mistakes, and one of the few mistakes, because they run an extraordinarily tight messaging enterprise, but the Conservatives made a huge mistake when they found the excuse of a carbon tax to vote against a free trade deal between Canada and Ukraine. They're going to pay a heavy price for that. It was childish. Their answers and their explanations were just silly and ludicrous. The Ukrainian embassy was saying, please stop this. It's just hurting us. How can you be against this trade deal? And yet they had convinced themselves in their idea that since they were against the carbon tax, there was a reference in there to some environmental issues which exist in all of these trade deals these days, and somehow they were able to vote against that. I think that probably contributed heavily to the 5-point drop that the Conservatives went through just at the end of the session.
All right, Tom Mulcair, CTV News political commentator and former NDP leader, thank you very much for joining us today.
All the best. Take good care.